All right, Evan Perez, appreciate it. I want to get some perspective now from CNN senior law enforcement analyst Andrew McCabe, who was deputy director, FBI director during Crossfire Hurricane, whose name comes up 58 times in the Durham report.
Then in July, at the end of July, we learned that months earlier, before that information was released, a member of the Trump campaign, George Papadopoulos, told a representative of a friendly foreign government, a trusted friendly foreign government, that they had been offered exactly that assistance by the Russians. So we knew what the Russians took, we knew how the Russians used it, and then we learned that the Russians offered to do exactly what they had done before they did it to the Trump campaign. So with that information, not unverified intelligence, actual information, we opened a full investigation. And everyone who has looked at what we did, other than John Durham, determined that that decision was absolutely appropriate.
Well, he says the FBI used, and I'm quoting, raw, unanalyzed, and uncorroborated intelligence.
I can only assume that what he's referring to there is the comments that Papadopoulos made to this trusted representative of a foreign government.
The report is very critical of disparaging comments about Donald Trump made privately by two key members of the investigative team, Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, who anybody who was following this knows those names. Were you aware of their feelings at the time? And looking back, should they have been involved in this investigation?
I was not aware of their comments, their private conversations via text message between each other about their thoughts about Donald Trump and their thoughts about Hillary Clinton and the election writ large. Had I known about that, no, they wouldn't have been involved in the investigation, but nobody knew about that at the time. And I think it's important to point out that in the IG's investigation, the DOJ Inspector General, they looked very deeply at all of those messages and determined that neither Pete Strzok nor Lisa Page was ever in a position to significantly influence the decisions that were made by people like myself and Director James Comey during the course of this investigation. So, yeah, those comments were objectionable and they were unfortunate and they subjected the organization to immense scrutiny, but ultimately were not responsible for the investigative decisions that were made.
The Durham report also says that the FBI handled this investigation differently than it handled allegations of possible attempted foreign election interference plans aimed at the Clinton administration. Do you know what Mr. Durham is referring to, and were those investigations handled differently?
Yeah, it's a ridiculous claim. And I think, to the best of my understanding, he is referring to a piece of intelligence that was received at the highest levels of the FBI in 2016 about some comments or communications allegedly made by people associated with the Clinton campaign that they were going to essentially manufacture some sort of narrative that that Trump had ties to the Russians in order to hurt his campaign. Look, the fact is, we knew what the Russians were doing and had done in an effort to help Donald Trump. And if we had had any information, any intelligence or information that indicated that the Clinton campaign was colluding with the Russians, we would have investigated that as well. But that information doesn't exist, and to my knowledge was not happening. What you heard in that intelligence that was declassified by John Ratcliffe was a campaign strategy, maybe an underhanded, unethical strategy. I don't know. That's for others to decide. But that is not a violation of federal criminal law or the creation of a threat to national security.
Did it surprise you that there's no new recommendations really in this report for the Justice Department about changing procedures? I mean, there have been a lot of changes at Justice based on the Inspector General's report back in 2019 and others.
Yeah, I'm not surprised at all because John Durham has failed to come up with anything new. Most of the report, the parts that I've been able to read in the last few hours, are a regurgitation of findings that were made by the Inspector General. Their attempt to justify two failed prosecutions that he brought against Igor Danchenko and Michael Sussman. There is nothing new here. And that's what we saw today. We knew from the very beginning this was never a legitimate investigation. This was a political errand to exact some sort of retribution on Donald Trump's perceived enemies in the FBI. That's what Mr. Durham has done.
And you stand by the original Russia investigation?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Listen, the mistakes with the Carter Page FISA were regrettable, should never have happened. And had I known about those mistakes in the packages, I never would have signed those applications. And shame on us for not knowing. But that's all business that the IG presented to America in 2019, I think that came out.
Yeah, it was.
absolutely nothing new in this report, and I stand by the investigative decisions that we made to open the investigation first on the Trump campaign and the possibility that the Russians were trying to influence it, and then later on Donald Trump himself. And what did we find out from Special Counsel Mueller's investigation? The Russians did, in fact, influence the campaign. They wanted to. They tried repeated times. They had many, many contacts with the Trump campaign, and several of those people were indicted. So I guess what we were worried about all along actually happened.
Andrew McCabe, I appreciate it. Thank you. New details.
Thanks.
Good evening tonight. After 4 years and very little to show for it in terms of actual prosecutions, John Durham, the special counsel chosen by then Attorney General William Barr to investigate the FBI's Russia investigation, has reached a conclusion. In a 306-page report released today, Durham says the FBI should never have opened the investigation known as Crossfire Hurricane at all, concluding that the Bureau overly relied on raw and unconfirmed intelligence, writing that they lacked evidence at the outset of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. And this stands at odds with the 2019 Justice Department Inspector General's conclusion that there was adequate basis for opening the inquiry. We'll talk shortly with Andrew McCabe, who was at the FBI at the time, joins us. He has long defended the investigation. He'll give us his first reaction to this report. The former president has seized on the report, is claiming vindication, though it certainly does not, as he once claimed it would, reveal, quote, the crime of the century. For more on what's actually in today's report, we're joined by CNN's Evan Perez. So what stands out to you in this?
Well, Anderson, the lack of any new prosecutions, that stands out because we were expecting, or certainly we were led to believe by the former president, by the former administration, that this investigation was going to find crimes. They were going to find conspiracy by the deep state to go after Donald Trump. What John Durham concludes here is that there was no necessarily political bias. What he says was there was confirmation bias, and there were mistakes by the FBI, some of which were already detailed in an Inspector General report back in 2019. I'll read you just a part of what Durham says. He says, in short, the FBI discounted or willfully ignored material information that did not support the narrative of a collusive relationship between Trump and Russia. And he also goes on to say an objective and honest assessment of these strands of information should have caused the FBI to question not only the predication of Crossfire Hurricane, which is the name of this investigation, but also to reflect on whether the FBI was being manipulated for political or other poor purposes. Anderson, the bottom line from John Durham, though, is that he doesn't recommend any major changes for the FBI and the way they handle politically sensitive investigations.
In the report, Durham talks about something called the Clinton plan. What is that?
Well, this was something that emerged back in 2020. There was some information that was declassified by John Ratcliffe, then the Director of National Intelligence. It appears that back in 2016, the intelligence community got some intelligence from the Russians that appeared to indicate that there was a plan in the Clinton campaign to tie Trump to Russia. And it was never corroborated, but it is something that John Durham spends a lot of time in his investigation going after. He actually interviews Hillary Clinton back in 2022 about this. It appears that that information is still, Anderson, not corroborated. It may have been falsified. And in the end, what John Durham concludes is that there is no prosecutable criminal offense in the way the government handled that information. Again, that dates back to 2016, uncorroborated as it was. Anderson?